On this episode of China Unscripted, China backs Russia's war in Ukraine, the communist New World Order, and TikTok goes the clock for TikTok. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
And the big news this week is Xi Jinping and Putin finally got to meet face to face. They haven't seen each other since some unpleasantness in Ukraine.
Oh, I guess the last time they saw each other was the Olympics.
Right before.
When Xi Jinping allegedly asked Putin to not invade until after the Olympics were over. Wasn't that a story that came out?
Yeah, that was. Totally unbelievable. I wouldn't buy it.
I mean, I'm glad that these two dictators who are otherwise very
What,
isolated.
Matt? I can't hear you over your shirt.
Were you just waiting
Yes.
until the first time he said something?
Yes, I've been waiting an hour to use that.
I was going to make a point. The point is that it's nice that these two men who are otherwise feeling so isolated in their lives can have this long-lasting friendship.
Actually, I do think that Putin and Xi Jinping really enjoy each other. Like, I think they're actual friends as much as,
Two authoritarian dictators can be.
Yes, actually, because they've seen each other, 40 some times?
In the past decade, yeah.
Yeah. And, they've made dumplings together. They've had
Putin
vodka.
got Xi Jinping his favorite Russian ice cream.
For his
Like
birthday.
Fox's, yeah.
Yeah, like they were at some international meeting in Southeast Asia or something, and Putin brought the ice cream with him. Like, yeah.
I mean, it is. It's a beautiful friendship.
They
And
literally gave each other giant gold friendship necklaces.
I mean, even murderous dictators need friends, people to share their innermost feelings with. And
Well, that's why right before the invasion of Ukraine, they talked about their no limits friendship. No limits.
Yeah, I mean, I think genuinely they do share a lot of worldviews, right? In terms of,
Yeah, that's true.
thinking like Putin wants to regain the glory of the Russian Empire. Xi Jinping has his China dream and
my
needing to
gosh.
take over Taiwan.
They're both like Londo Mollari from Babylon 5.
Okay.
This is a perfect comparison, actually.
You're going to have to explain that since neither Matt and I have seen Babylon 5.
Londo Mollari was the ambassador to the Centauri Republic. Basically, it's based off of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Well past its glory days. It's sort of like a fading star. And like he longs for the good old days when it was like, real empire. And so he basically makes a deal with demons to restore it.
Hold on, there are demons.
They're
in
space
Babylon?
demons.
Okay.
oh, that's a little more realistic.
Yeah,
I think.
it's more realistic to have space demons. Than
Yeah.
theological demons. Okay.
Yeah. It didn't work out great for him.
Doing deals with space demons doesn't, on the face, sound like it's going to work out great for you.
No. I mean, he didn't know they were space demons immediately. He should have known something was up. But so yes, it is an apt comparison. Watch Babylon 5.
So you're saying that Putin and Xi Jinping have made deals with space demons?
I think that's it.
Possibly. I'm not going to deny that. This is the internet, after all.
I do think, okay, also, they both think the fall of the USSR was a tragedy, right?
I don't know how Londo Mollari feels about that.
Yeah. Well, okay. And what else? What else do they share in common? I suppose the love of Russian ice cream.
Yeah, murder.
That too.
Murder most foul.
Yeah.
They have different ways of going about it, though.
They both want to take over territory that's totally theirs.
Yes, exactly. That's part of the rebuilding the empire thing, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was historically part of Russia or China.
Yeah. And I mean, this is why it's like so ridiculous when like China says like, hey, we can be, an impartial negotiator between Russia and Ukraine.
The peacemaker?
Yeah, the peacemaker. Yeah. Like and they came up with this 12-point plan that doesn't like say anything. It doesn't, it says things like there should be an end to hostilities. Okay. Does that mean like Russia withdrawals, Ukraine surrenders?
The important thing is that we need to stop the sanctions and
Sanctions should be
also
stopped.
Ensure supply chains.
Yes.
ensure grain imports. I was happy to see that was in there.
Right.
Important for
Well, I mean,
the peace plan.
That's important for China because China has a kind of impending food crisis.
Well, also, it was already getting loads of grain from Ukraine. It did a lot of trade with Ukraine.
Yeah, China
before
actually
India.
had bought a lot of land in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I had read some article about how that region of Ukraine, that's kind of the breadbasket, has been pretty devastated by the war. So I'm imagining they're not getting the grain imports that they want from Ukraine.
Right. So really there should be peace. And, really whoever ends up holding that territory, it doesn't matter because China still owns it.
China owns Ukraine.
Well, if they bought up a bunch of land, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Well,
There's
it's
kind of
in the sense that China has bought up a bunch of farmland in Ukraine. I mean, China has bought up farmland all over the world. So, they'll probably be okay without it. But at any rate, so here's what I want to ask is, at the end of the meeting, and we can play this clip, Xi Jinping said something kind of funny to Putin about how they're going to work together on changes that haven't been seen in 100 years.
You mean like funny haha or funny strange?
Funny strange. Well, let's play the clip first.
这也真是那百年变局第一部分，我们共同这种。
Это как раз сейчас перемены, которые не было в течение 100 лет. Там, где вместе двигаем эти перемены. Перекиньте, пожалуйста, дорогой друг.
So what do you think that means?
Well, what happened 100 years ago?
On March 21st, 1923, which is exactly 100 years before he said that.
Whoa.
Yeah, well, the U.S. foreign minister refused to diplomatically recognize the USSR. So I assume that's what they were talking about.
Well, isn't it also like the end of the Bolshevik Revolution?
Yeah, when they'd finished taking over Russia.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like the completion of the Soviet Empire. Well, to some degree.
What was happening in China?
In 1921, the CCP was first established with the help of the Soviets. So, I mean, that's roughly 100 years ago, the beginning of the communist revolution. And it kind of sputtered for a while, and then it took decades before it would really take over the mainland China. But maybe that's what they're referring to. It's hard to know exactly what he was talking about.
I think clearly he's saying communism is back in fashion. Either that or flappers.
It's probably
Could
flappers.
be flappers, yeah.
Yeah.
Or a global economic crisis, something like that. That took a little longer.
That
The
wasn't
Great
until
Depression,
29 after
Yeah.
the stock crash affected U.S. and Europe. Yeah. So it really could be a lot of things. And maybe it's good to have a little bit of mystery.
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely clear that the overarching thing going on between China and Russia is like forming more of a united front against the West, the United States, NATO, the EU. Because for some reason, we keep complaining about the genocide and the military aggression.
I do think that it'll be interesting to see how long people play along with the Xi Jinping's like China as a peacemaker thing. Because if you look at a lot of what he was saying when he was in Russia, most of it was about how this is NATO's fault.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where the CCP and like Putin, they align in terms of not in terms of like what's happening in the war necessarily, because I think that China would also be fine if there wasn't a war in Ukraine.
Mhm.
But in terms of, okay, this is NATO is the baddie and we need to keep them out and anything is justified in order to do that.
Well, Chinese state-run media has also been essentially pushing Russian disinformation about the Ukraine war all along. Haven't they been pushing the, denazification kind of route?
Yeah, and definitely the whole, I think we did an entire episode about how they were blaming all of this on NATO, and there were some really weird, like, political cartoons that they had made.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would even call them political cartoons because they were almost like also AI images in a way. Like they were CGI-ish stuff about Harry Potter. Do you remember this? Where they compared
remember.
NATO to Voldemort?
I don't remember that. I should.
Yeah.
It sounds like it'd be relevant
Because it
to
has
my interest.
Horcruxes across Europe. Yeah.
But there were several different articles about how terrible NATO was. There was like an entire series, but in one of them, it was about how NATO was basically Voldemort.
Are we sure they're talking about NATO or natto, that Japanese fermented bean thing? Because I can't stand that.
That's bad. That's Voldemort, in your opinion?
Totally. It's a weird fermented life form.
Yeah.
Distorted.
I think Chris is right.
That might be spelled with 2 T's.
Oh, I'm sorry. America is the Dark Lord.
Oh.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Here it is.
What? It's so weird. There's a lot going on there. China does seem to be leaning heavily into like AI stuff. Like they had another thing about an AI TV anchor. I think they're really just good. And like that's obviously like some weird AI political cartoon. Like I think they're just really trying to take the people element out of communism.
And how do you take the people out of the people?
You kill them.
Well, no. I think this is what Mao said in his People's Democratic Dictatorship speech, that like there are certain people who are the people. And then there are the other people who are not the people, like the rightists, the counter-revolutionaries, the running dogs for the West. Those are not people.
Some people are more people than the others.
Yes, I think that was the point.
Yeah, and so really, this is what Xi and Putin were saying, that like they're trying to make this communist world empire again.
It's their time.
It's their time.
Yeah, but so it's interesting to see like the U.S. and the EU still try to kind of
see China as like a potential peacemaker.
Well, I don't think they actually see it as a potential peacemaker, but they're kind of making those noises, right? In terms of being like, oh yeah, we welcome more solutions.
Yeah, China could do something.
Yeah, I mean, it worked out so well with North Korea.
Meanwhile, it sure seems like China is selling weapons to Russia.
No, I mean, it's just Chinese companies selling assault rifles.
Yeah.
To Russian companies.
It's not, they're not selling, and body armor. It's actually quite sad to see. My sister sent me this Reddit post that had like a screenshot from, I don't know if it was Alibaba. It was one of the Chinese e-commerce sites, and it was selling kind of like body armor, and the reviews, the comments were all from like Russians who had ordered the body armor from China because their own military wasn't providing enough body armor. So these people get drafted or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And they have to buy their own body armor.
What were the reviews good?
I mean, if there were bad reviews, probably those people wouldn't be around to leave them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's dark.
But yeah, so that was kind of sad to see. But also the assault rifles and things like that. But that's not, the U.S. is saying, well, that doesn't count.
Well,
right?
that's so weird about what the U.S. is doing, because they're like, China cannot sell weapons to Russia, but they're leaving the loophole open of like Chinese companies in a totalitarian communist system where the government controls all industry. If a Chinese company sells weapons to a Russian company, which is also entirely controlled by the government, that's okay. That's not the same thing.
Well, as selling directly artillery or something, I guess.
Seems pretty weak.
I mean, maybe we'll see Chinese companies selling artillery shells to Russian companies, or Chinese companies selling, other.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to keep this loophole. And here's the reason. So if the U.S. formally recognizes that Chinese companies selling weapons to Russian companies is equivalent to China selling Russia weapons, then the U.S. has a kind of political obligation to take action against China. For example, sanctioning China the same way we sanction Russia, or but think about how devastating those sanctions would be. The amount of trade that the U.S. does with China is like more than an order of magnitude above what we do with Russia. So losing trade with Russia, the U.S. economy can withstand without too big of a blip. But sanctioning China in that same way would cause such an enormous and immediate negative impact on U.S. industry and commerce that it would be politically very difficult. And you have to think about what the ramifications of that would be. So
have you been bought off by the engagement school?
Well, let me finish explaining this, and then you can answer that. So, you've got an administration that is, as any administration would be, is looking at re-election in less than 2 years, and an economic hit from putting meaningful sanctions on China would be so big it would last at least up until that election. And so, because Americans may not understand the nuances of this, it'd be easy to say, oh, well, the Biden administration did something to wreck our economy.
Which people already are saying.
Yeah. And so that's going to hurt the chances of Biden or Harris or whoever the DNC runs from getting elected. And that is a huge political problem. And so even if sanctions are the morally right thing to do to stop China from helping Russia kill civilians in Ukraine, it's politically a very dangerous thing to do. And I think that's why we're not seeing, we're certainly not going to see Congress united on something like that. We're not going to see the Biden administration do it unless they absolutely are really, really forced to.
Unless Xi Jinping actually shows up with missiles.
Right. Well, and I think that it's important to, I would like to see some incident that's like a spy balloon type incident, which everyone can kind of unite around, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, and say, oh, here's a reason that the U.S. has to put those sanctions on China for this, because that will force the Biden administration's hand. And it also will be like, well, it's not the Biden administration's fault. They had to do this. And so then I think that Democratic voters, or swing voters are really the important ones in a presidential election, voters will be like, yeah, it's not really Biden's fault.
Well, I mean, U.S. elections are almost never about foreign policy.
Right. But so that's the point. It's like the only way the Biden administration can do that is if something happens that forces them to do it in such a public way that voters excuse them for that.
I can see what you're saying. What I find interesting about this whole scenario, though, is that nobody forced the Biden administration to publicly say or warn that China was thinking of selling weapons to Russia and they better not, or else there would be consequences, right?
Yeah, that is interesting.
Because that, now you're kind of asking them to call your bluff if you don't really mean it. Like,
yeah,
if
you can't draw a red line if you don't intend to enforce it.
Yeah, so if the sanctions are as devastating as you're talking about, Matt, then why would they say this in the first place? Are they just hoping that by kind of shining a light on this, like, the CCP will be too scared to sell Russia weapons now?
I think that might have been the calculation. I mean, there also could be people within the Biden administration who actually do want to sanction China in a much harsher way.
Well, I think it's good if, the American people become aware of the fact that China is selling weapons to Russia for fighting in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean,
and then that can create pressure.
I've seen some comments in our videos that say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, the U.S. is selling Ukraine weapons. Why can't China sell weapons to Russia?
Well, that's worth answering that question.
Yes. You want to answer it?
I was going to offer you. Okay, so my view is this. China can sell weapons to Russia, but given that, if Russia's the enemy of Ukraine in this war, China joins Russia, so China's the enemy of Ukraine, and if the U.S. is allied with Ukraine, then China essentially becomes officially an enemy of the U.S. So China can absolutely do that, but the consequence is that then they become an enemy. So, the U.S. is publicly being like, hey, we are allied with Ukraine, and we're taking that stance, and we are 100% on board with that. So China either chooses to oppose us and be at war officially, in an official sense, or they try to pretend like they're neutral. And that way they don't get sanctioned, right?
Well, I mean, also there's a pretty big difference between giving weapons to a side that is defending their country from a much larger, hostile, authoritarian military-industrial complex and then giving weapons to Russia.
The side that's
Doing the
actively trying to
invasion, yeah.
invade another country.
Yeah, I mean that's the moral side of it. But I'm just in terms of the political side, like China can make whatever choice it wants, and the choice is between being at war with the U.S. and not being at war with the U.S. And they do get to make that choice.
I think the important thing to remember here is that America is Voldemort. So, obviously, if China was forced to sell weapons to Russia, they're only justified in trying to counter the aggression of America and
They're
NATO.
part of the resistance.
I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's the hero of their own story.
Yeah, I'm sure Xi Jinping is the hero of his own story.
I think he is too. And also, I think that Russia and China have a sort of old world view about taking over territory. There was a view, certainly prior to World War I, that might makes right, in the sense of if a country has the ability to militarily occupy other territory and hold that territory and administer that territory, it actually has the right to do that because it is somehow therefore a better ruler than whatever was there previously, right? And that's an older traditional view that many countries had in the 17th, 18th, 19th century.
I mean, that's been the worldview for most of human history.
Yeah, and that changed starting really with World War I because the world was like, you know what? When countries do this, it kind of turns out really, really badly. And then especially, and then we did the League of Nations to try to stop that. And it failed, and we had World War II, had the United Nations to try to, again, stop that. And I think now the worldview in almost every country is that it's not might that makes right, it's good governance that makes right.
I'm with you until the last sentence.
The good governance that makes right.
I don't think that most countries think that because
most countries are dictatorships, actually.
I mean, or not, if not outright dictatorships, authoritarian.
Most countries are, for all practical purposes, authoritarian, even if they have elected presidents. But when I say most countries, I erred. It's actually the dominant Western countries that I'm referring to. So U.S., Europe, Commonwealth countries, that sort of thing. Yeah, but I think that you got to understand that China and Russia really do fundamentally have a different worldview where they do believe that it is their right to take over weaker countries to make them better.
I hear you, but we have to work with China on climate change.
This is an interesting thing I found about Blinken's speech about China last year, where he kept saying things about, China is wrecking the international order. And like, if China wants to be a responsible, member of the international order, it needs to blah, 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 blah. But like, what's the premise is that they want to be a responsible member of the international order?
Well, violating it and destroying it.
Well, they don't want to. And
Yeah.
in fact, Xi Jinping is coming out with his new, I forget what it's called, but it's essentially like a global, like a new world order kind of framework. And it's not called New World Order or it's called Global something, and I can't remember the whole name right now, but we should actually probably do an episode about it because he's talked about it in a speech recently at the National People's Congress and stuff like that, about how there's this new framework that China's going to lead the new global order, essentially.
Ah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they're already starting to do that. Like, it's not like a sudden change. So some of the ways they've done, I mean, Belt and Road is the most obvious, right? Where it's not just about loaning money or even debt trap diplomacy. It's about getting into these countries and working with those leaders who are, by and large, dictators, to get them to start doing things the Chinese communist way. So that would be like mass surveillance, smart cities, and allowing them to monitor political dissension and arrest people who disagree. A kind of using Chinese-controlled or Chinese-backed currencies, could be like digital currencies. So already there's like these Chinese communist methodologies that are seeping into Belt and Road countries. And if that becomes widely adopted, then that is a kind of Chinese New World Order. In the same way that the U.S.-led world order after World War II has a lot to do with like the American dollar being kind of the basis of trade, American culture and technology being the basis of other countries' development in many respects.
Yeah. Also political,
Right.
ideology.
The ideology of freedom, free speech, that this ideal that other countries want to achieve something that's similar to, American civil liberties, right? I mean, look at all the countries that have become more democratic since World War II, breaking from their dictatorships to be more of the American model, right? Like Taiwan's a great example of that, even though some people view that as not a country. But like, yeah,
I mean, it took Taiwan until a while. Yeah. Till the late 80s.
places
really.
in Africa, including South Africa, Spain,
South Korea was a dictatorship.
South Korea, Japan, although the U.S. kind of wrote their constitution for them. But like, it's countries led by movements of the people wanting to be more like the American model. And now what we're seeing is countries led by dictators wanting to be more like the Chinese model, because that gives people who already have power more control and an easier way to retain that power.
Well, and it's not just at a country level. Like China recognizes the power of, transnational, international institutions like the UN, like the World Health Organization. That that these organizations in some ways are kind of trying to put themselves on top of individual countries governing themselves. Like things like the Paris Climate Agreement, where it's an agreement by leaders of countries without input from their constituents.
Yeah.
And so there is a real risk that these international institutions will become like this new authoritative power in the world
That
is
China
not
can-
democratic. Yeah,
that China can then essentially control through bureaucratic shenanigans. And
So the thing she is going to be talking about is not like, hey, we're going to try this new thing. It's like, this is what we've been doing.
but it sounds so good. There's a lot of peace in it,
Imagine all the people living in harmony.
I mean, in terms of the Belt and Road stuff too, it's I think also sneaky to really recognize what's going on in a lot of these cases, because the way they get in is economically, right?
Yeah.
And we have post World War II also built up this idea that finance and trade and things like that are the way to maintain peace in the world, right? So then China can kind of use that.
Well, it's like that in that New York Times editorial we talked about recently, where like they said, like, compared to most superpowers, China's like a homebody. They don't military interfere with other countries. It's just economics, and like they're missing the point that like those economic, that's their method of warfare. It's economic warfare. The Belt and Road is economic warfare. And like just to not even see that, it's pretty
they're just
disappointing.
helping these countries that have totally just want the help, right?
Yeah, it's very disappointing to see like the most influential newspaper in America holding those views.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some truth that the U.S.-led world order after the Second World War, which involved a lot of investment in Europe to rebuild Europe, as well as investment in many other countries.
And using the military to keep trade routes open.
Right. Like, that I think that actually worked fairly well in a lot of places. And it worked, in say, South Korea, for example. I had a friend who was in the Peace Corps in the 70s and went to South Korea when it was an impoverished dictatorship. The U.S. lent military assistance and also had Peace Corps go in, and it was influential, right? I mean, they went in, they taught English, and people learned about American values, and the people of South Korea eventually pushed that government to liberalize and become more democratic. And it's similar with Taiwan. So, like, there really was value in that trade, in that exchange. It's the difference is that when that economic integration is led by the U.S., you lead to kind of one typical result. And when it's led by the Chinese Communist Party, it's still economic integration and trade and cultural
They'll build
integration.
hospitals.
They'll build, it's just that because behind it is this authoritarian, corrupt regime that infects everything, and that infection spreads and it gets passed on to everything that happens in those zones. And so even though it seems to be the same method, because what's behind it is so fundamentally different, the results are going to be fundamentally different.
I don't even know if it's exactly the same method, though, because a lot of what the Belt and Road does is also, like exporting Chinese companies, Chinese state-owned companies making profits and things like that.
Sure.
It's also to enrich the Chinese state in a different way.
Yeah, but I think the same argument could be made for, take Coca-Cola, an American company going into these other countries, and they're providing an American product, and a lot of those profits end up coming back to the United States.
I mean, I don't know how much.
Let's not take Coca-Cola, but let's take something like Ford Motor Company, right? Or General Motors, providing vehicles which have an important positive economic impact on trade in those other countries, and they're making America profits. I mean, that is,
but
in many ways,
Ford only hire American workers and send American workers abroad to, Africa or Asia, and then not, contribute to the local economy, et cetera.
Also under the direct control of the U.S. government.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are differences, right?
Yeah. And I think those differences are, that's kind of one of the propaganda tactics, to be like, oh, America does the same thing, if not worse. And yeah, you really do need to look at the differences. Like, yes, the U.S. has had an economic hand in countries around the world, just like China. If you take like this cross-eyed, blurry look.
Right.
And look at what happened in the Central African Republic this past week, or was it 2 weeks ago now? There was, essentially an attack on Chinese workers at mines that were Chinese-run mines. And it was like a local uprising, essentially, where people were upset that the Chinese workers were taking their jobs, et cetera, and these Chinese companies were coming in.
Yeah.
And so.
Right. So, and my point is, again, not to say that these are the same. My point is to say that it does really appear that it is the same on the surface, right? But everything becomes totally different when you see what's behind it.
Well, yeah, it's like you were saying. It's like you see the fruits
right
down the line.
So the New York Times is getting it wrong because they're saying America did economic exchange and cultural exchange, and China is doing economic exchange and cultural exchange. And they're missing the whole point, which is that they appear to be equivalent, but they're really not equivalent. It's like comparing apples with rotten apples.
Okay, I got it.
Yep. Thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chat.
No, there's more to talk about. There's so much more. But let's move on to another topic, shall we?
Well, okay, the next thing I guess we could talk about is how the CEO of TikTok lied to Congress, basically.
I mean, he just said that ByteDance wasn't owned or controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Is that really a lie? I mean, it's not owned by the Chinese Communist Party.
That reminds me, today I saw on the World Economic Forum website, I'll put it up, but like this whole little blurb about TikTok and, about the positive environment it's trying to create. Well, no connection to China.
You know why that's on there, though? Because TikTok's one of their partners.
How about that?
TikTok is a partner of the World Economic Forum.
I mean, a lot of companies are partners of the World Economic Forum. So is Facebook and,
Yeah. I mean, and this ties in with what you were saying earlier, Chris, about these supranational organizations.
Yeah.
That have broader authority than just the government of a country.
In my mind, I was like, Facebook is a supranational. I mean, it kind of is in some ways.
Yeah, but World Economic Forum. Yeah. That's a great example of like one of these, like what really are these things?
Well, I think World Economic Forum is also weirder than the UN because countries came together and formed the UN.
Yeah.
The World Economic Forum is it was founded by people who are not, leaders of countries or whatever, right? And it's the whole thing about Davos, man, and everything is that these are the kind of rich, elite, smart people that should be,
really running the world.
Right.
Like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or whatever, not actually elected leaders.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what's interesting is
beholden to individual voters.
Yeah. So the World Economic Forum, which hosts Davos in Switzerland every year, like who attends Davos? It's actually a lot of world leaders, including the U.S. president has attended many times. And so
Yeah, Xi Jinping's been there.
So you have leaders of the biggest countries that do go to Davos, and they use it as a way to have kind of backdoor meetings and channels, but it's kind of like a mix of that plus them meeting with business leaders. So it is still very, very political. It's just
and it's very
run
influential.
by billionaires.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
well, it allows for like even leaders of countries who supposedly are beholden to voters to kind of have this weird power that it's not seen by
Right. It's
And there's
totally
like-
outside voters.
And there's
Yeah.
also a weird celebrity element to it as well,
Mhm.
like the way that it's covered in the media and stuff like that. It's like, who's going to Davos this year, et cetera, et cetera.
My favorite part is just how they all fly in on their private jets and they talk about the importance of battling climate change.
And then
Yes.
also the after-hour parties with Russian prostitutes, apparently.
That's right.
Well, not
yeah.
this past meeting because the Russians weren't invited.
Hmm.
So, I mean, where are they going to get their prostitutes from?
If only there were prostitutes in other countries.
So,
I mean, that was what we had a story about Davos, and it talked about this Russian oligarch flying in all these Russian prostitutes for an after party, basically, right? Yeah. Just to give the context of why we're talking about Russian prostitutes.
And also to emphasize that the World Economic Forum is awful. If you didn't get that from their promotion of TikTok.
I have an idea for a TV show. It's called Super National, and it's about these two, ordinary guys who, team up to fight these supranational powers
Okay. How do they fight them?
with words. This is a newly developed concept. Maybe words and some kind of, I don't know, podcast.
Hey, Hollywood, if you're watching right now, bidding starts.
Yes, this is an A+ pitch.
I imagine them actually being more like Jason Bourne type characters who are, awesome.
Podcast hosts by day, assassins by night.
Yeah, it sounds like you're talking about assassination.
Yes.
No,
Jason Bourne was kind of messed up.
yeah, but I mean, I don't mean what the government wanted him to do, because he didn't. He tried to be good after he woke up from.
He lost all his memories.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the point. He tries to do something good and take down the baddies.
Oh, that
right?
reminds me of an episode of Babylon 5.
Go on, Chris.
They have this punishment where, like, if you're like a murderer or something, they use psychics to like wipe your memory and personality, and then you're like a new person and you are reintegrated in society.
That's terrifying.
It is terrifying. Yeah, and they kind of talk about that.
That's actually like what the CCP does, only opposite. Because the CCP, if you're like a religious person or a dissident, they try to brainwash you into becoming just like Communist Party officials. So they try to wipe out the good part and replace it with the evil part. It's kind of like Babylon 5.
I've heard of Babylon 5.
Yeah.
We should have an entire podcast about Babylon 5.
Yeah, I'm going to
except-
push it until I get more people to watch it.
Well,
Except Matt and I will have not watched Babylon 5, so the
Let's
entire
let
podcast
Chris-
will be stuff like this.
yeah. Well, but we're talking about TikTok and how we got into this because TikTok is one of the partners of the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, that was a rabbit hole we slipped down.
But TikTok, the CEO testified before Congress and basically flat out lied to Congress and the American people, just flat out lied.
Yeah, he said the Chinese company that owns TikTok, ByteDance, has no connection,
Well, no,
To-
it's not owned or controlled.
not owned or controlled.
Well, it's not owned.
Right.
And then he started going into like 80% of or 60% of TikTok is owned by, foreign investors.
Uh-huh.
20% is owned by, the original Chinese investors. And then 20% are owned by employees.
Right.
See,
And I think 10 years ago, Americans and even many members of Congress would have kind of accepted that explanation. But it's so clear now that because of the civil military fusion that China has, and because of the national intelligence law,
And there's
from
a
2017, the cybersecurity law in 2020. Like, it's so crystal clear that even enshrined in official Chinese law is language to the effect of the Chinese government can have, XYZ type of control of any private company or actually Chinese citizen, even if they're abroad. And so, like, now that the Chinese government has taken the step of enshrining it in their own law, there's essentially no way to say that the Chinese government doesn't have control of Chinese companies.
Well, TikTok has a solution. They've got Project Texas, where they'll have a new database in Texas, and American user data will all be in Texas. They're working with
Oracle.
Oracle, that's right.
Oh, I trust Oracle.
Well, Oracle is also like, we don't control. They're using our cloud computing systems, but we don't know what they're doing with them. Like, they're like, we can't guarantee anything here.
Remember what happened 20 years ago with Oracle and how they basically helped China go from zero to its mass surveillance system?
What happened with Oracle?
I don't actually know this.
Oh, well, they sold a lot of equipment, servers, and whatnot to the Chinese government.
Oh, I thought that was just Cisco. Oracle did it too?
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, Cisco also.
I mean, Cisco built the firewall for them in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, yeah, how do you think Oracle's Larry Ellison made his billions? A big part of that was China. So, so I would say that that's not a completely innocent, or I would say that that company is not independent of Chinese influence anyway. But the whole point is Project Texas is still not going to work, because even if all the data is stored in the US, there are still potentially, and I would say very, very likely, going to be backdoors for the Chinese government to access TikTok user data. Even if that data, again, is stored in the US, it could still be accessed.
I mean, there have been multiple articles from BuzzFeed and Forbes and different, media talking about how essentially, like, that ByteDance had access to TikTok data many times when they weren't supposed to be.
Even more than TikTok employees had.
Spying on American journalists trying to report on TikTok.
Yeah. And then on top of just the data access, there's also the essential part, which is the algorithms. So all these social media companies, including TikTok, are essentially run by algorithms, and a lot of it is AI, which basically encourage users to watch certain content and not watch other content. And so, even if the data is stored in the US and not accessed by China, you still have Chinese influence in what videos get promoted and what get essentially censored.
Do you remember that girl who made some video about the Uyghurs in China and then it got taken off TikTok?
Yeah. That's right.
There's that. But also there's just something like even more like degenerate about TikTok. There's something about like what it is. It's just so corrosive to people's brains. I think kids these days, they're not, get off my lawn.
They didn't have MySpace.
Yeah.
That reminds me when I found your old MySpace profile
a
number of years ago when we were in Norway. Do you remember
that?
Yeah, I remember
you
that.
were also friends with Tom.
I was.
But also, you had a
betrayed
waxed
Tom.
mustache.
Yes, a nice little curly, cute mustache. It was great. But actually, it's funny how TikTok has been responding to this, kind of in like what you were saying earlier about, why the U.S. government would be hesitant to really put the screws on China for selling weapons in Ukraine to Russia. They are pushing this whole line of, hey, there are 150 million U.S. users. They love this. Biden, are you sure you'd want to?
I mean, they didn't say that
as specifically.
Right.
I'm reading between the lines, but yeah, it's definitely they're pointing to like an election's coming up. Do you really want to ban something that so many, particularly young Democratic voting voters,
are using?
Vote for?
Yes, like don't take away their TikTok.
Well, I mean, most voters between 18 and 35 vote Democrat, right? And so that's also TikTok skews younger. So it was a clear crossover for that. And I think that if we had a Republican president, and a Republican-led Congress in both houses, you'd probably see TikTok being banned immediately. But also keep in mind, like, that's their political calculus, right?
Although the Biden administration has supported that Restrict Act that is going through Congress
That would allow the government-
allow the government to ban TikTok or other foreign
Right.
apps that have
And it does
undue
seem like it
influence.
might be a better tactic than what the Trump administration tried to do, where Trump himself basically tried to use executive powers to ban TikTok, and that was on a little bit of a shaky legal ground.
Right.
But now this is current ban. Unfortunately, there's now 50 million more TikTok users, but actually having this go through Congress would be a little more.
It does seem the
feasible.
Biden administration doesn't really want to have to actually ban TikTok, because it seems that they've been pressuring ByteDance to just sell TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
That's their preferred way to get out of this.
Yeah.
But also,
But it won't work very well.
I
It
mean,
won't
I don't
actually work
think-
to protect American users.
well, besides just that, I don't think the Chinese Communist Party would let ByteDance sell TikTok.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, because then a U.S. company would have access to the algorithm. They may be able to see any backdoors or like weird things they have in there, you know?
The secret AI god that has been summoned from another dimension that's in the core of the algorithm.
Maybe
The
it's space
space
demons.
Yeah, we went to the same place.
But I would really applaud the Biden administration if they do have the courage to ban TikTok, because that would show a strength that goes beyond partisan politics. And I would say that if the Biden administration can ban TikTok and have the courage to do that and do it in a way where they can explain to voters why, then it's possible that that would even be a political advantage.
The explaining to voters why thing might be a little tricky.
Yeah. It would be hard. because-
Especially the young people on TikTok who can only listen to something for 30 seconds.
Well, then you got to make a TikTok video about why you're banning
But if it's
TikTok.
banned,
Well, then you just make a reel, right? Or this is one thing I kind of wonder why, Facebook and Google, like these other
aren't more into
are
banning
more
TikTok.
into banning TikTok, because that is like a direct competitor, right?
Yeah.
Like YouTube Shorts. That's obviously trying to rip off TikTok, right?
Yeah. And it always sucks on another platform for some reason. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've not had TikTok on my phone ever
Yeah.
because of obvious reasons. But like, I can see that, Instagram is a little better at doing that than YouTube is.
I guess so. But yeah, it will be interesting to see what the Biden administration does, because I really have no clue. Like, in some ways, they have been pretty strong on China. In other ways, it's been very bad. It's real. I have no idea how it'll go.
Did you see the clip? I didn't watch all of the CEO's testimony to the House committee, but there was a clip of a congresswoman tried to ask him about the Uyghurs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he just kept avoiding the question. She was like asking him if he personally believed that there was like that China was repressing the Uyghurs, something like that. And then he kept just being like, "I'm here to talk about TikTok." And then like he just refused. Like she asked like 3 times and he just kept refusing to actually give an answer about the Uyghurs. So that was, that was a moment.
Interesting. Hey,
Yeah.
we should make a little reel of that.
Yeah. Well, when people refuse to answer yes or no questions with a yes or no, that should always be a sign that they're hiding something. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things you have to factor in when you're discussing how to, with the relevant facts and information and the different departments.
Avoid talking about genocide and things like that. Yeah.
What was it? I can't hear you over Matt's shirt, Shelley. That should have been his defense. That's why everyone in Congress wears, drab suits and stuff, so everyone can hear.
That's why. Oh man, yeah. But like the CEO's testimony, he started off with like, like I was born in Singapore, and then like I had this opportunity to come to the U.S. Like he was trying to kind of like make himself into like the American dream kind of.
Pulled myself up by my own bootstraps.
And like now I'm the CEO of TikTok, this wonderful company who we're trying really hard to like protect teenagers from our content. Like that's not what he said, but it was essentially like we're building more ways to get parents involved and make a safer like social media atmosphere for et cetera.
Didn't they also create like an election misinformation center for
Yeah, they
midterms?
tried to do that. I don't know how widespread it was. We did this whole episode on America Uncovered about also politicians trying to use TikTok, which was very bad.
Hello, fellow kids.
Yeah, like incredibly terrible, actually. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, do we have the space to talk about space?
What about space? Does it involve demons?
In a sense, because it involves the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh.
So basically, China has announced that on their space station, they had successfully completed a rice harvest. They took rice grains and they grew them and then produced more grains. So it's like technically that they have like completed a harvest, which means, right? And as we know from the movie The Martian, if you have grown crops somewhere, you've successfully colonized that place.
Well, where was this? Was it like just
So they
floating
colonized
in
their
orbit.
own space station?
Well,
Or they colonized all
I
of the
would say
vacuum of space?
they colonized all of the vacuum of space.
Oh wow! Tonight the sky is red.
Right. I mean, firstly, I kind of have my doubts that even if they say they did a successful harvest, that they really did. Like,
Well,
I'm not
and
even
like
sure that's
also,
the whole
what
story.
could that mean? Like,
Yeah. So, I mean, just also if you look at like the number of scientific announcements that have happened in China where it turned out later that it was falsified, I would say like there's a high chance of this just being fake or somewhere on the spectrum of truth to fake that's closer to fake. And then, but on top of that, like it would be scary if there's some kind of excuse that like, oh, well, we have rights to this place because we've grown crops here.
I mean, is the Martian thing true?
Well, no, that's a fictional movie, Shelley.
No, I meant like the whole thing about if you've grown crops somewhere, you've colonized it.
Well, it's only true if the majority of countries recognize
Well,
that
I mean-
that's true.
Also, the vacuum of space is a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure China will try to do it on the moon as well, and make every effort to claim specific territory on the moon. And so I think this is just like one.
Well, I mean, the moon's been part of Chinese territory since ancient times.
Right, but it's like the excuse that, oh, well, Chinese fishermen used shoals and islands in the South China Sea historically, and therefore this territory has belonged to China since ancient times. And even though a lot of the world is like, well, that's stupid, there are still many countries that are willing to, especially countries that don't have an interest in the South China Sea, are willing to recognize China's claims.
The Central African Republic's like, sure,
Yeah.
why not?
Well, yeah, but even if many countries don't recognize the claims, just like China making that claim is kind of like what happens next after China makes the claim? Well, then they have a justification to start building it up. They have a justification to militarize.
And then it becomes like, well, okay, they're making this claim. What are you going to do to stop them? And it's like,
Right.
nothing.
Because like, oh, we don't want to stop China's scientific research into growing crops.
Or even with like the South China Sea, it's like, well, we're not going to start a war. Like, it's bad that you built these islands, but we're not going to start a war over it. Just don't militarize them.
And then Xi Jinping was like, I pinky swear in the Oval Office. And then they did
Yep.
militarize.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I would say that it's just one very small initial step towards China's ultimate goal, which I think is, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say space dominance. Obviously, we're not talking about all of outer space, but we are talking about a kind of space dominance as it applies to warfare. So you have space dominance in Earth orbit, which involves many military applications, from spying to launching and directing missiles to interrupting other countries' communications and send them back 100 years in terms of their communications technology. So that's...
are we going to start having to use telegraphs again?
Well, I mean, you can use anything that's, over wires, right? That won't be affected by space. But like, yeah, I mean, the telephone technology, wire to wire stuff was around 100 years ago, but not cell phone technology, which relies on satellite relays, right? So the whole point is that China is taking little baby steps to control more and more of space, and most of that space is, Earth orbit. I would say the moon is part of that too, because there are many potential military applications of the moon. For example, launching craft and building crafts because of the low gravity environment, and potential minerals there, although I don't know the mineral content of the moon. But
I mean, Chang'e has been there for thousands of years.
That's
so
right. Yeah.
Since ancient times.
I mean, it actually is an interesting idea, because if China does become the dominant power on Earth and in space, that means they're probably going to be the ones to make first contact
With the space demons.
with the space demons, and that could go poorly.
I mean, it never goes well, as we know from Babylon 5.
No. Yes, like that show that you love.
That's right. Like the show I love. But, I mean, recently a U.S. general warned that China is the biggest threat in space.
That's only because he couldn't talk about the aliens.
Oh.
Yeah. Or the Decepticons.
Yeah, whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, it's Decepticons. On the moon.
On the moon.
Yeah.
But also, I think the U.S. is really concerned about that. Recently, the United Arab Emirates, which is the country that for Abu Dhabi and Dubai are part of that sort of country of city-states, the UAE. The UAE wanted to add a craft to China's next lunar landing device. But because that craft built by the UAE has some American components, the US has basically said, oh, well, you can't work with China on any space launch because of this, it's like a 1976 arms law that prevents that. So basically, there's already like this fight where like China's launching spacecraft and other countries want to work with China to like tack on to their launches, because not very many countries have launch capabilities, right? It's only a few countries plus a few private companies. And so this is part of like this battle, right? Where the U.S. is trying to enforce as much as it can its laws to stop any country from working with China's space program, because of course that helps fund China's space program, and it helps legitimize China's space program,
Which is run by China's military.
It is
The Communist Party's military, rather. So.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that there's, that battle we're seeing played out in a lot of different respects.
This is not how I expected the space wars to go.
How did you expect it? Pew 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 pew.
Something like that.
There's no sound in space.
Yeah. That's my biggest problem with Star Wars. But anyway, that was a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So maybe they had sound in that space.
It's a fair point.
Yeah.
It's a fair point. How do some podcasts end? Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I guess we can't do better than that. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
Talk to you next time.